I'm not guilty. I didn't do it. Please, I'm begging. Hi, my name is Chris Comer. If we're talking about the music scene, all my friends call me the Gooch. That's been going around for a while, so some guys in Clifton know me as Chris Comer, and some of them know me as the Gooch.
Can you tell us a little bit about, did you grow up in Cincinnati?
Yeah, I grew up in Cincinnati. I'm from Green Hills, went to St. X High School, and was in my first rock and roll band when I was in high school in the early 1980s with a bunch of guys up in Fairfield who called themselves the Uninvited Guests. And the funny thing about the Uninvited Guests is the very first basement recording we ever made, which was a hit song called Surfing on the Dead Sea, was played on the radio a week after we recorded it, which kind of freaked me out. When you're 15 years old and you hear yourself on the radio, you're like, wow, this is the big time, right? 96 Rock up in Hamilton used to play home tapes in the morning, and they would take tapes of local bands and play them. And some of the guys in the Uninvited Guests ran into Bender and Fingers at Perkins one night, gave them a cassette tape that we had recorded the week earlier of Surfing on the Dead Sea, where you dance around like a gorilla on the Sinai Peninsula. And they played it on the radio, so that was the beginning of my music career, and I thought, well, it's only going to be up from here, right? Right.
So how long was the Uninvited Guest around?
Oh, about a year and a half.
And did you?
And then I went to college. See, what happens is you're in a high school band, but then I was the first one to leave for college. Then they had another version of the band after me, which is another story, but I go away to Bowling Green and get a music composition degree up in Bowling Green, Ohio, where I play in a bunch of other rock and roll bands and where I didn't apply myself in school enough to really have achieved anything at it. But I did achieve at playing in some rock and roll bands off campus, and I met my first Raisins up there. You know, I didn't meet any of the Raisins in Cincinnati. I met them all in Toledo. When I first got to Toledo, my dad introduced me to some older guys who played in a blues band. Now, even though these guys were older guys, they were only about 30. But I was, 18 or 19, so a 30-year-old guy was an older guy, right? And there were these guys called the Haircuts, and they played up at the Ottawa Tavern in Toledo. And the first time I went to see the Haircuts, the drummer says, hey, you're from Cincinnati, right? Well, I used to be in a band called the Raisins. I was like, no, you weren't. The Raisins are in Cincinnati. Bam is the drummer. And he's like, no, the Raisins are from Toledo. I was the first drummer. It was Chris Arducer. So now I'm hanging out with Chris Arducer. 3 months later, I'm up there watching the Haircuts, and Chris says, guess what? Larry London died. I'm going to Nashville to join the Bears. I was like, no, you're not. He's like, yes, I am. And then he introduced me to Tom Toth, who was another one of those original Raisins. Tom was one of the co-writers of Your Song Is Mine from the first Raisins album. And I played in a little band with Tom for a while. Tom was a real asshole. I mean, he really was. But that's where I met Derrick Anderson, the bass player, who's now in LA, playing with legitimately famous people. And the drummer, Bart, who was a friend of mine up there in Perrysburg, was in the band. And Bart is the drummer in our current group, the CC3. So he and I go way, way back to 1986.
Well, at Bowling Green, can you talk a little about that music program that you were part of? Didn't you get introduced to a lot of different...
Yeah, the music program at Bowling Green was awesome. I was doing piano auditions in high school, and I wasn't very good because I didn't practice real hard. I really didn't. I did an audition over at CCM, and they said, no way, Jose. But somehow I got in at Bowling Green, and when I didn't succeed at piano performance, because I don't play the Rachmaninoff stuff very well. That stuff's hard. So I got in the composition department, which was actually more fitting for me, because you got to be creative and write stuff, and I got keys to the recording studio. And I would go in the recording studio at night and record stuff. And that's when I started my first improvising bands. But while I was at Bowling Green, taking lessons in composition and music theory and all this other stuff, they would have visiting artist programs and a new music festival every year. So I got to meet some important people. Now, I'm an undergrad, so the graduate students meet the famous composers first. But John Cage came through, John Adams came through, and a bunch of other people that you may or may not have heard of in that contemporary academic music scene. And I remember having pizza with John Adams, but I was down at that end of the table because all the graduate students got to sit up there with John and talk to him about, his new operas. But me, I was just eating pepperoni down at the other end of the table. But it was still a good experience. And like I said at the beginning of this segment, if I had applied myself in college a little more than I was applying myself at drinking, I could have probably achieved a lot more. So if there's any young people right now watching this, stay in school and don't do drugs.
Well, what were some of the music projects you worked on while you were in Bowling Green?
Well, the ones that were exciting to me were getting the keys to the recording studio and going in at night and making freaky recordings. And I told you, I started my first improvising group, which we called Clunk. Bart was in that, Bart, this drummer I told you about, and then a bunch of other characters I knew from around the Toledo and Bowling Green music scene, including some other students and some guys who were in rock bands who weren't students. And when I say improvising, this was a style where we do a free improv. There's no tunes, there's no score, there's no composition, there's not even a sketch. We just go into a room and we turn the instruments on and we just start playing. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Now, I got the idea partly from some of this contemporary academic music where they would improvise, but that was more just like wood blocks and a violin, right? We were doing a rock band thing, and my biggest influences were these groups from New York that I was discovering at the time, which were Naked City, the John Zorn Group, Last Exit with Sonny Sharrock, and some of these other New York type groups. Fred Frith's group, Massacre, was a big one. They would just go out and improvise. Sometimes it would be hard rock improv, and it didn't sound anything like the stuff you heard on the radio. And in my humble opinion, we got pretty good at it for a while. After school got out and I came back to Cincinnati, some of the guys that were around, we resumed these projects, and it would be on again, off again through the 90s and early 2000s. But we did some incredibly cool stuff, and there's a Bandcamp page called umclunk.bandcamp.com if you want to hear some of these recordings, which includes my senior recital. My senior recital at Bowling Green broke the record of the loudest senior recital anyone ever had at that university. So I guess I got that feather in my cap.
So you came back to Cincinnati. What did you do as far as anything music? What did you?
Well, after college, I come back to Cincinnati, and that's kind of when some of the most creative stuff I did was going on, because I had a part-time job at a record store. I get a job working over at Wizards because I didn't apply myself enough in college to get a good degree to get a good, serious job. So here I am, schlepping records over at Wizards, trying to get a job in the radio business, and an old friend of mine, R.W. Hessler from high school, he's got a theater group now, and they call themselves the John Body Players. And I'd always wanted to do improvised movie soundtrack music to a live theater production, which wasn't really ever done, has never really been done by anyone. Also, our improvising group did shows in planetariums. So I'm looking at really kind of ambient, soundtracky kind of applications for this improvised amalgamation of sounds, okay? And so between the John Body Players and these planetarium gigs, and then having access to different musicians through the different music scenes I'd been in, both in college and on Short Vine in Clifton, now I've got guys in the band. Rick Hickey played with us for a while. We did one basement session with Rick McCullum from the Afghan Wigs. Some of the guys in Schwa, which was a local band up in Clifton, they were in and out of our group. And these movies, the theater soundtracks were really interesting. We did 5 or 6 of these things with the John Body Players where they had a script and a show, and we would go in there, and each show was different. Each show had a different lineup of musicians with a different objective, but each show was an experience in us putting together ambient background music to something that was scripted.
Where was that?
Well,
Where did they take place at?
we did these shows at various theaters, kind of squatting wherever Hessler could get us a theater to perform in. But over the years, we did them at the Ensemble Theater. We did them at the Carnegie Theater over on Scott Street in Covington, the basement of the Cage Art Gallery, which isn't around anymore, and some various other places like that.
Now, some people know you not just as a musician, but a lot of people know you from being a radio personality, I guess.
And nobody knows me from radio because no one ever listened.
But can you touch on a little bit about your radio career?
All right, so shifting from the music thing to the radio thing, I'd always been interested in radio and specifically talk radio. Even though I'm a music guy and I love music, there's no good music on the radio. There really isn't. And even when I was in high school, and we're talking about the late 70s and early 80s, when supposedly WEBN was at its best, they're still just playing Led Zeppelin and the Eagles, right? Which gets pretty boring pretty fast. But it was sometime in high school that I discovered WAIF. And back then, it was a lot different than it is now. It was even weirder. And I heard some of the things that I wound up liking later in life for the first time listening to WAIF. But then I heard the Jerry Galvin show. And Jerry would take calls, and he would scam people, and he had all these inside jokes. And I started calling into his show, although I don't think he ever liked me. And there were other talk radio shows I would listen to. When I was a real little kid, my grandmother and I would stay up late at night and listen to the Larry Glick show on WBZ in Boston. 10:30 a.m., WBZ. And Larry Glick, in the mid-'70s, was really the first guy to do an overnight, late-night talk show and take calls and talk about UFOs and Bigfoot. But he wasn't doing it like Art Bell. He did it with a little more tongue-in-cheek and a little more of a sense of humor. And Glick was really good at getting callers to talk about themselves. For example, if a guy calls into WLW right now, and the host says, "Hello, Jimmy, you're on the air. What's on your mind?" And Jimmy says, I don't know. Then he's going to get hung up on. But if you did that to Larry Glick, Larry would start asking you questions like, well, what do you do for a living? And where are you from? And what kind of religion are you? And do you play a musical instrument? And he would get to the bottom of who you are and find interesting things. Like there's a tape that floats around where he's got a guy who calls in who doesn't have anything to say, but by the end of the call you find out he's a former mafia hitman. Now that's how you get a caller to talk about themselves, is you dig into it a little bit. They don't do that on radio anymore. Well, we were doing that. And then as the show, I started doing this in Bowling Green at the campus station, WBGU. But when we got back to Cincinnati, myself and Rob Irvin, who was my radio buddy up in Bowling Green, he's from Hamilton, and he moved back to Cincinnati around the same time I did. So we started the show on WAIF called the Chris and Rob Late Night Talk Show. And it was called the Late Night Talk Show because we were on from 2 to 5 a.m. But you know what you got at 2 to 5 a.m. is you have dedicated listeners because there's nothing else on, right? There's no David Letterman at 2 o'clock. At 2 o'clock, you got nothing on TV but static, and there's nothing else on the radio. Art Bell wasn't around yet because we started in 91. Art Bell was only local in the 80s and 90s. He hadn't gone syndicated till the later 90s. So we had, at 2 in the morning, we had the world in the palm of our hand. Now, we only had weirdos calling in because it's 2 in the morning. So you got weirdos, night shift people, and cops. Who else is up at 2 in the morning? But we had a great show. And we took calls, and the thing was really spirited. And if you want to hear any of these things, they're at chriscomerradio.com. And Brian, I've given you some links for some other like secret archives I have of other older shows. But the thing expanded over the years, and before you know it, we're doing celebrity interviews. And we interviewed, over the course of 17 years, we interviewed politicians, movie stars, rock stars, jazz musicians, classical composers, you name it. Jerry Lewis, Billy Bob Thornton, members of Led Zeppelin and Bad Company. All kinds of people had been guests on our show. I can elaborate on that if you want, but the tapes kind of tell the story if you pull up the tapes at the link.
Well, I'm not sure. You sometimes would try to promote local musicians in some of their albums.
Yeah, well, now one thing I never did is I didn't do radio to promote my own bands, right? Now there's this story about how Don Imus originally got into radio so he could play his own record, right? Well, I'm not like that. When I did radio, I tried to keep it separate from all the music stuff I would do. So I never went on the radio and said, come to my gig Friday night, but I would promote other people's gigs. And I was telling you, Ricky Nye was a guest on our show a lot whenever whenever Ricky was promoting his Boogie Woogie summits, and he would bring in these guests from Europe and across the country, I made sure that every year, the week before Ricky did his show, that I had him on. We didn't have a large listenership on WAIF, but I figure any help we can give to Ricky or any of these other people we would have on. And there were a lot of other local bands that we would have on. I have a whole tape of Shoot the Gift, which was a punk band from Clifton featuring Bones on drums. Bones, who was killed by the cops and didn't have it coming. I could go off on that. And a lot of other local bands, you know. Anytime a band, Maurice Mattei would come by sometimes. I have interviewed lots of interesting people on the radio show, and if you go to chriscomerradio.com, there's an archive. So go to chriscomerradio.com, and it's spelled CHRISCOMERRADIO, there's 2 R's in there, .com. And on that website, here's the interesting story behind the website. Around 2007, we quit the show. We'd done it for 16 and a half years. Rob and I hung it up for a whole lot of reasons we're not going to get into right now. But at that time, I made an application to get a job at NPR in Washington, D.C., which I never got. I didn't even get an interview from those bastards. But in lieu of a resume, I created a web page that had the best interviews that I ever did, in my opinion, with musicians and celebrities that had an NPR vibe to them. So a lot of jazz interviews, Ahmad Jamal, people like that. So if you go to this page at chriscomerradio.com and click on music interviews, you'll see that I've interviewed John Zorn, Fred Frith, John Anderson from Yes, John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin, Adrian Belew, who's another Cincinnati guy. Ben, it's not on my website right now, but I got an interview. I did the very first interview that Ben Folds ever did. His new record had been out for 3 weeks in 1993, and he was on an independent label then, didn't have any hits yet. I called his record label and scheduled an interview, and we had him on 4 or 5 times over the years. So Ben Folds was regular with us for a while. One time, when Jerry Lewis was performing down at the Aronoff Center, he called in. And that was the only time I ever got nervous, ever. I don't get nervous. I don't have stage fright. I mean, you see me here with your camera. I can do this all day long. The only time I ever truly was a little nervous was when we were waiting for Jerry Lewis to call in, because I've seen interviews with him in which he will embarrass the host bad, because he's kind of an asshole, right? So I was nervous about that. I thought, oh, he's going to call us up, and then he's going to raise hell with us and call us names and embarrass us. And he didn't. He was cool. He didn't want to do a long one. We used to make crank calls. And this is one of the things that I really enjoy, was making crank calls. Now, we would crank call just local people, local politicians, whoever, but we would also crank call celebrities. And I recently uncovered an old tape where we made a crank call to Jack Nicholson House, and Jack actually answered it. Jack actually picked up the phone and he said, hello, and you recognize his voice, you're like, that's Jack. And we would do stuff like that all the time. One time we made a phone call as a crank call to Larry Flint, you know, from Hustler magazine. And this was when he was, I can't remember the year, but he was trying to make a comeback and get Hustler magazine to open a store down on Fountain Square. And Simon Lease was trying to stop him, and it was in the newspapers. So Rob and I call up Larry Flint, and he actually answers. And we start talking to him. First, we start talking to him about this whole thing with Simon Lease. And then I go, Larry, I got an idea for your next month's centerfold. You got a pool table, you got me and Rob, and you got these 2 blondes. And I go on, and Larry's like, I think I can make that happen. So, you know, we do stuff like that. We also interviewed we interviewed classical people too. Paavo Järvi was on our show. Richard Stoltzman, the clarinet player, was in town to perform the Takemitsu Clarinet Concerto, and he came down and talked about the concerto in depth, which would have been something you could have put on WGUC, but WGUC doesn't have time for me. We had on Raymond Littlehammer. Raymond Littlehammer was the guy who coughs on all the famous classical music records. And he called in and he talked about the time that Leonard Bernstein was conducting a Mahler symphony, and during the Adagio, Go to the website, chriscomerradio.com, and I don't have to tell you any more stories.
Another thing that you were part of, a band that you were, was the Soul Expressions?
All right, so fast forward to right after the turn of the century, in the early 2000s, I had been in this band called the Fabulous Marvel Bees. The only time we ever made a CD was this. Can you see on the camera that it's black in a plastic cover with this metallic silver logo of the Marvel Bees? Originally it was called Marvel Bornemann. It was Mike Zagotti's band. Mike Zagatti had this idea to call his band Marvel Bornemann. But every time we booked a gig, they'd misspell it because nobody could spell Marvel Bornemann. Any kind of spelling you could think of for Bornemann, they would make up. So finally, Mike and I go, let's just shorten it to the Marvel Bees. All of a sudden, they can spell that. So on every marquee and City Beat ad, it would say the Marvel Bees, but then we added a horn section, and we got funky. So then we had to call it the Fabulous Marvel Bees. So we make this CD, and the packaging is really cool because when you open the CD, it's a disco ball. All right? Brian, put this in the library archives. Give it a catalog number so people can look it up, all right? I don't think you have one in the library because when we made those, I don't remember giving you guys one. So the band, the Marvel Bees, was a good band. It got really good until we booked too many gigs and a couple of the guys in the band didn't want to play so many gigs. And the thing, like every other band you're in, it's got like a little bell curve and it peters out after a while. But the drummer had a job at the airport and he knew this guy named Derrick Sanderson. And Derrick would go to karaoke night with all the airport guys and they would get hammered and Derrick would always do Michael Jackson songs. So Dave had this great idea. Let's bring Derrick over to the band and have him sing Michael Jackson songs with the band. Well, it turned out Derrick had a pretty good voice and he could sing soul music. Not just Michael Jackson, but Prince and other things like that. So after a little while, I started writing some songs. And Derrick and I would get together, and Derrick would put some words to the songs until we had, somewhere north of a dozen songs. And then I put a rhythm section together with Chris Walker on bass. Chris was the bass player with Heavy Weather, and Chris Verbanek on drums, who had been in L'Ohio. That's Ohio with an L at the front. And the four of us worked out these songs and played a few gigs. And then we made this recording over at John Curley's studio, Ultra Suede, of about a dozen or so of these songs, and we had an album ready to go. We never pressed up the album. We should have. There were some issues with the mix, blah, 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 but it is now on Bandcamp at Derrick Sanderson's soulexpression.bandcamp.com. And like I said, there's a dozen songs or so and some outtakes that I put on the Bandcamp page. And we were up for 2 Cammy Awards for Best Soul Band, and we performed at 2 Cammy events. One was at the Taft Theater downtown, and the other one, if I forget. So we performed at it. We were nominated for Best Soul Band. Both times Freakbass won, and that's the way it goes. And then, like everything else, there's a bell curve, and the band kind of dissolved after a little while. Chris Walker passed away. Derrick Sanderson moved to Boston, and Chris Verbanek got married.
So what did you do after that band?
After that band, I moved to D.C. for 10 months, and then I moved back and became an alcoholic. Cut to commercial. All right. All right, part 2. Let's start part 2 of this instrument, of this.
Didn't you start you started doing more experimental music again?
Well, I've always been doing the experimental music thing. Like I said, the clunk thing would always come and go with me. Every now and then, a gig opportunity would pop up. I'd call these guys. We'd go improvise because you don't really need to rehearse for that, right? It helps if you do. I'm going to elaborate on this. When you have a rehearsal or a practice, you're going to learn tunes. Some guy wrote some songs, or maybe you're going to do some cover songs or learn something. Maybe you're even going to learn songs by the Eagles, but whatever you do, you're going to practice these. Well, you don't practice improvising. I call it scrimmage. I would call the guys, we have a little scrimmage, right? Let's go in, let's improvise for 10 minutes and tape it and see what we think. Let's go improvise for 30 minutes and tape it and see what we think. So we would do these little scrimmages. After a while, I started writing more music, and I wrote a small little movie soundtrack once called Brothers United Against the Man. And you can find it at umclunk.bandcamp.com. It's like a 5-movement thing that's supposed to sound like an old gangster movie, with a chase scene and a love scene and a thing with the end credits and everything. And we did that down at the Southgate House, which was really cool. We did that in 2001, I think. But some time goes by, and what you're leading me into is this whole CC3 thing, which is my current group. The CC3 is short for Chris Comer Trio. It took me forever to think of that. If I'd called the thing Chris Comer Trio from the beginning, it would have solved me a lot of problems. But I didn't. It didn't take me until about 4 or 5 years ago just to actually start calling the thing the CC3. And what occasioned that was I'd been doing these jazz gigs. Now, I'd put off learning my jazz for a long time. I told you that when I was a student at Bowling Green, I didn't apply myself as much as I should. And I remember taking a class in jazz improvisation in which I was just terrible. If the teacher, Jeff Halsey, was here right now, he would tell you, this kid was terrible. I couldn't play jazz for nothing, man. It was awful. The worst thing you ever heard. But a little time goes by, and I had this attitude, too. I had this attitude that, hey, I got to do my thing that's more original than that. I don't have to learn traditional jazz. I can do it my way. Well, that was wrong. You know, maybe a lot of kids think like that. But I got into my late 30s and early 40s. I'm 57 now, all right? This is my end-of-life interview here. I got into my late 30s and early 40s, and I realized that that's no attitude to have. I'm not going to succeed going down that road. So I learned my jazz. I got out the fake books. I learned how to voice those chords on my left hand. It was a little harder to get my right hand flowing with melodic ideas, but eventually it got a little better. And I called Steve Schmidt. Steve is the best jazz piano player you're going to find for 200 miles in any direction. And Steve was gracious enough to come over to the house on 2 occasions and sit down with me at the piano and give me a lesson. Although Steve would say it wasn't a lesson, all Steve said was, listen to what you play and see if it sounds right. Try it like this. Try it like that. Try it here. Try it there. Invert it up here. And he wasn't talking to me about music theory like math. And that may have been a part of my problem over the years is I would take lessons and it would boil down to all this music theory, which is math and intervals. And if you're thinking of all that math on the fly while you're playing a song, and maybe the song's even at a pretty fast tempo, and these changes are going by lickety-split, and it's hard to keep up. But Steve, he doesn't think like that, and he was convincing me not to think like that and to think in terms of sound. After those 2 lessons with Steve, he left, and for another 2, maybe 3 years, maybe another 10 years, maybe to this day, I'm experimenting with how a chord sounds. Now, yeah, I got to know the right notes. I can't put the wrong notes in, but I'm still experimenting with how it sounds, and I'm not thinking about the math. Now, if I have to explain it to a kid, I can tell you how the math works. But from a performance point of view, I just want it to come off and sound right. And I want to be original. I don't want to play the accompaniment the same way the guys on the records do. So this is a process that takes years, not an afternoon. And it takes decades. The famous guys will tell you they're still working on it. Well, I'm obviously still working on it too. So what am I getting at by all this? I learned my jazz. I start going out and I start doing some jazz gigs. The first few years, the jazz gigs weren't really that good. But they're giving me experience. And I'm bringing in different guys in the group now. And I'm working with different guys. One of them, again, is this old friend of mine, Bart, on drums, the guy from Perrysburg. He's still around. He was in schwa, in the Clifton music scene back in the day. He's been in a bunch of other bands. I've known the guy forever. We don't always get along, but we've been together a long time. He's been playing drums off and on with me, and I was going through this struggle that a lot of jazz guys have with these bass players. Because these bass players, they come and go like girls in college, man. You can't keep one around for a week. And it was frustrating because I'm trying to build a group with some continuity that knows its repertoire, and at every gig I got a different bass player. And one day I meet Michael Ronstadt. He's really a cello player, but he plays bass lines on his cello every bit as good as these so-called jazz bass players do. Plus, he's got that bow. So anytime we're playing a Christmas song, he grabs the bow, and all of a sudden, now we're in the wonderful world of Disney. And he's creative. He's not just a good player, but he's also creative. He's well-rounded. Michael can play the classical Bach stuff. He can also play folk and rock and jazz and anything he puts his mind to. And it's because he's good, you know. There's no more to it than that. He's no more special or unspecial than anybody else. He's just really good and creative at that cello. So once I start doing some jazz gigs with him and we start hitting it off, we start doing trio gigs with me on piano, Bart on drums, and Mike on cello. And we're doing some straight-ahead jazz stuff, but I realize Mike is good enough to do some of this improv stuff. And me and Bart have been doing this improv stuff in our Umclunk band for years. So we start developing some improv and some original material. Mike Ronstadt composes, I compose, and Bart even composes a little bit, even though he's a drummer. You know what's the last thing the drummer said before they kicked him out of the band? Hey guys, want to do some of my tunes? So we do some of our tunes anyway. And we recorded 2 studio records. What happened was COVID. I got opinions on the whole COVID thing, but we won't get into that here. The advantage I got from COVID was everything in the world got canceled, and Mike Ronstadt had keys to a recording studio. So I say, Mike, let's go up to the studio Sunday night. We'll drag Bart along. We'll just make some demos and see how it goes, right? Well, we went up to the studio that Sunday night. Everything else is closed because it's COVID. This was 3.5, 4 years ago, right? And we record for 3 nights. We set up on a Sunday night, and we spend 3 nights recording with me on the Fender Rhodes, Bart on drums, and Mike on cello. And when the tapes were done, we listened back to them, and we're like, wow, these are actually pretty good. And I'm my own worst critic. I'm the first guy who's going to shit can a recording if it doesn't sound good. But these things surprised even me. So I say, let's distribute these to some of our friends and see how they go over. And everybody kind of liked it. So we put it up on Bandcamp as Session 1. And it's on cc3music.bandcamp.com. And the first record, Session 1, has originals by myself and Ronstadt and some improvisations, which are the most interesting part of the record. Right after that, we had a gig to play up at the Planetarium at the Boonshoft Museum in Dayton, which I've done some of these off and on over the past 20 or 30 years. They have a great planetarium up there. And something I've never heard of anybody doing in the whole world, except for some new age guys back in the 80s, was playing a gig in a planetarium with the light show and the universe and the space going on above you. And in the planetariums, they can do more than just have Mars go by, but they can spin things around and do lasers and psychedelic effects. And we'd be in there jamming with our psychedelic improv music, and it's kind of cool. So we recorded that gig at the Dayton Planetarium, and we put that on our Bandcamp page as the second album, called Live at the Dayton Planetarium. And it's 2 40-minute improvs from 2 sets we did that were about 40 minutes each, of a sky show in a planetarium with us playing along. And it's complete improv. We're just making it up as we go. We're bouncing off the ceiling like the ceiling is the 4th member of the band. So if the projectionist does something on the ceiling, that might cue the band to do some change in the music. Or if the band is changing up something in the music, that might cue the projectionist to do something different on the ceiling, like add some comets or some Saturns, or have some spaceships fly by. This is one of my favorite gigs in the whole world, and I should be doing more of them. We do this planetarium gig, we put that up on Bandcamp. We do a second studio record, which we creatively called Session 2, which had more of our compositions and some improvisations. And then our Bandcamp site has filled up with more records because we've done 3 or 4 more live gigs since then that we recorded, edited, and then posted on Bandcamp. The most recent one was live at Memorial Hall, which we recorded last March at Memorial Hall down there, next to Music Hall. They have a series called Jazz at the Memo, and they invited us to play. I was very flattered by that because I don't get a lot of invitations to play these big venues like that. So I was really flattered. We go in there, we put together what we thought was our best material because it's a big room. I think we sold a decent amount of tickets for a room that big because it's hard to fill a big room. It's not hard to fill Stanley's. You put 10 people in Stanley's and it looks like it's sold, it looks like it's filled to the gill. But you put 15 people in Memorial Hall and the place is still empty and you can still hear the crickets. We put together a pretty good show, I think. We recorded it, and then after a little bit of editing, we put that one on Bandcamp as well. And we've been invited back to Memorial Hall this coming February, on February 3rd. Brian, I made flyers for you. So take a flyer and please bring all of your staff down to Memorial Hall on February 3rd to see our gig because we've put together another show of what I think is some of our best material. We're going to open the show with our version of Music for Airports by Brian Eno. If you're familiar with the piece, you know that it's one of these. Music for Airports was like the first ambient piece that got some attention from the mainstream, The whole concept of ambient music is something I could go into for hours, and I'll spare you here. But it's minimal, it's pretty, and it's going to be a good lead-in to what we're going to eventually get to, which is an original concept called Music for Spaceships. So we're going to start with Music for Airports, and then by the end of the night, we're going to feature our Music for Spaceships, which should be balls to the walls.
Didn't you do something at the airport here in Cincinnati with Art Waves?
Yeah. 2.5 years ago, Arts WAIF put out a program of music to be performed down at the CVG. And once I got down there, I realized what it was all about. When you're set up at the end of the terminal, before you go through TSA, because they're not going to TSA a bunch of band guys, right? They wouldn't let any of us in. So it's right before you go through TSA. And as the passengers come back from their arrivals, they walk by the band and ignore you. They got their suitcases, they just walk by and don't pay any attention to you. But what we did was, that was the first time we performed Music for Airports. It was myself on the Fender Rhodes piano with Mike Ronstadt on cello. And at that gig, we had Ron Esposito on the Tibetan singing bowls. Those are those porcelain bowls that go, right? So we've got that going on, and me playing the melody on the Rhodes, and Mike Ronstadt on the cello playing all the in-between parts. And the gig lasted an hour, so we played it for an hour, which is a long time. The original recording is 17 minutes. We did it for an hour. But nobody stopped and listened for more than 10 seconds because as the arrivals came by, they would just walk by and smile at us and then go get their Ubers and leave because these are airport people. But we did Music for Airports by Brian Eno at the Cincinnati airport, which is kind of cool. We're not the first guys who ever did Music for Airports at an airport. If you look it up online, a number of groups have done Music for Airports at various airports around the world. The most well-known group was Bang on a Can, who did it. Bang on a Can may have done it in a recital hall. I'd have to go double check. But I'm just saying it wasn't an original idea. It was just a good idea. But we know it, and we're going to do it now with our drummer Bart, because Ron's not around anymore. And we're going to do it with Bart now at our next gig at Memorial Hall.
Ron Esposito, you were talking about, I think you did a project with him where maybe it was his project and you were on it. Mm-hmm. We Are One. We Are One by Ron Esposito is a CD that Ron did. Ron had these singing bowls, and he would make these
ambient new age records. He recorded them down at Group Effort Studio, and he did, I don't remember how many of them, at least 4 or 5, maybe more. Sometimes he would get his music submitted for TV shows too. A number of his pieces are featured in TV shows. And I was a sideman on one of his records, you know. Over the years, I've played on different records by different people. I was on a Iswat record, which is on their Bandcamp page, and some other people over the years. But the one we did for Ron was called We Are One, and that's just, I played some Fender Rhodes behind him on the Singing Tibetan Bowls, and Johnny Ruza on flute, and some other musicians he had on these records. Well, see, I'm the old school guy. I still will drive around town and take paper flyers and staple them to telephone poles. Now, we used to do that stuff when we were kids. The cops didn't like it very much. Who cares, right? And in the old days, you drove around Clifton, every telephone pole had a flyer on it from one of my bands. Well, it's a new world now. We don't do that anymore, except for me. I still print up paper flyers and hand them to people. Here, come to our gig, right? I want you to come to our gig. You too. Everybody, come to our gig. That's how you promote a band, right? Also, you call your friends. Hey, Mike, we're playing Friday night. Come on down to the gig. Everybody uses Facebook these days. I hate Facebook. You know, it's not my thing. Facebook is a sweater that doesn't fit me, you know? I'm not going to wear it. I don't bother with it much. But I know that a lot of people do this, Facebook and other social media. So if that's how you're going to do it, that's how you're going to do it. If I'm in somebody else's band, they can go do all the Facebook posts. I send out emails. I print up flyers. It's old school. I probably could do it differently. I have a background in marketing and working at public relations jobs, and I know how to write a press release. And I still write press releases and send them to all the papers and TV and radio stations. If you want to do a seminar on how to publicize your band, product, or donut shop, I can do that. My dad is a SCORE counselor for marketing, which means he goes around and helps people with their startup businesses. And I've learned a lot just from being around that over the years. So, you know, the most frustrating thing is when you print up a bunch of flyers and you go down to the bar you're going to play at in 2 weeks and you hang them up all over, and then the bar owner comes and takes them all down.
Well, what do you think about, I mean, you're using Bandcamp now. How do you feel about Bandcamp as opposed to like having a CD that you would sell at a show?
You know, it's funny how I was saying I don't like social media, and I'm actually not really fond of the internet in general, but the Bandcamp thing seems to work. It seems, the way I look at the world, the way I think, it fits me. I like the way it works. I set the Bandcamp page up specifically for free downloads because that's not how I make my money. I make my money playing gigs and, you know, doing that. I'm not trying to make money off of the recordings. I want to share my recordings. I want people to listen to them and hopefully like them. Hopefully. You don't have to, but it's a bonus if you do. But really, the band, is it vanity? Maybe it's vanity. Maybe you put these things up just like if you're a painter, you hang stuff on the wall, but you're not famous, you just like to paint. Gardeners, you know, you're not feeding the world with your garden, but you like to tend your garden. You know, whatever your thing is, everybody's got something they do. These people who run marathons, I don't understand that, but you get up at 4 a.m. and you run for 50 miles. If that's what you want to do, well, I do music. So I put them up on Bandcamp, and it's easy. That's another thing, is it's kind of easy. You know, I find some of these other social media things kind of difficult, but Bandcamp is easy and it's effective, and I can look at it and see if people are listening or not. And for the most part, they kind of are. I get a decent amount of hits on the Bandcamp site, so it works for me. I can send it out in an email as a link. And again, I can say to people, don't pay for it. It's a free download. Just go listen. And if you like it, come to the gig next week, you know?
So with CC3, do you guys have future projects or something in the future you're working on or anything?
Well, yeah. Right now we're working on new material for the Memorial Hall gig in February. And for the gig we're going to do down here at the library in 2 weeks. We have a gig here at the library in 2 weeks on Sunday the 29th at 1 o'clock. Come on down. But we got some new material we're going to introduce that day, hopefully, if we can get more practicing in. And then we've got 2 gigs right after the holidays. We've got the one at Memorial Hall, and in January we're going to do one down in Louisville at the Outside the Spotlight series. That's kind of cool. For a long time now, there's been a series in Lexington, that's what I meant, Lexington, called Outside the Spotlight. And these guys put on free jazz concerts with out-of-town musicians who are usually from an avant-garde point of view, and they bring in well-known people. Now, when I say well-known, this is well-known in the jazz circles. Like they have brought in Peter Brotzman from New York, and they bring in Ken Vandermark from Chicago, and people like that. So for them to have invited us down to Lexington to play one of their shows, again, is flattering. Sometimes that makes me feel a little bit intimidated because we got to be good. We can't go down there and just, we got to go down there and be halfway decent. And I think we will be because we've been rehearsing, but we're specifically working on new material for that gig in Lexington and the Memorial Hall gig, especially because this Music for Spaceships thing, I really want it to come off. And then when that's over, we'll see what holds for in the summer. I haven't really thought any further ahead than that. But we always got something new up our sleeves. Like I said, Michael composes, and I compose, and Bart composes a little bit, even though he's a drummer. Have I said that yet?
I did want to ask you too, because you mentioned you were in a band in high school, and you guys were on the radio, of course.
The Uninvited Guests.
The Uninvited Guests. Well, can you tell me what year this was? Can you tell me
1983. Specifically 1983. The Bandcamp is the Uninvited Guests Cincinnati.bandcamp.com. Now, since then, 2 or 3 other groups have called themselves the Uninvited Guests. One of them was a heavy metal band from Norway or something. All right? So that's why we are the Uninvited Guests Cincinnati.bandcamp.com. So we get played on the radio in 1983 on 96 Rock. Twice, by the way. We were the only local band they featured twice. The second time they featured us, they played the song called The Effects of Global Thermonuclear War on Teenage Promiscuity, which featured the lyrics, life's no fun if we all die young, especially for the virgins. Then we wound up playing Battle of the Bands at Bogart's. Then we played, it's a long time ago. There was a Battle of the Bands at Bogart's we played, which there's a recording of, and a couple other this was high school, so we would do little high school dances and stuff, right? But we were doing original music at a time when other bands were covering Flock of Seagulls and Prince and the Cars, right? What was popular in '83? Like, I know no one in this room was even born yet, but in '83, what was popular? The Police. So we were doing stuff, other bands were doing stuff like that. The other local bands I remember, Van Halen was big then, right? That was like the peak of, people were Van Halen crazy back then. And we had a guy who would come occasionally and play guitar with us. And he was a Van Halen guy, and he, weedly, right? Everybody was doing that stuff, and we were doing songs like Surfing the Dead Sea and, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to ask about too. What do you remember about the other local bands? What were they playing?
There was the Complaints. There was Thruster. And Thruster had a great logo that looked like, it was sort of like a heavy metal logo in the early '80s, like Metallica or one of those. But since they were called Thruster, all we did was giggle, because we're a bunch of 16-year-olds, and all we're doing, Thruster. And I can't, so long ago, I can't remember what some of the other bands were called. I just remember Thruster because it would make us giggle, and the Complaints, because we wound up always playing gigs at Battles of the Bands against the Complaints, because they won a lot. And I don't know if any of those guys ever wound up in another band or not. I don't remember. There was Perfect Jewish Couple. Now, they're still around, but they're older than me, which puts them in their hundreds or something. We used to go down to, you know where Ruth Lyons Avenue is, back behind the Aronoff, I think? There used to be a bar back there called the Metro. And back in the early 80s, when it was more controversial to be gay, that would be a place you could hang out. It's obviously not as controversial anymore. People don't think like that anymore. But back then, you'd go down there and your parents would say, that's a gay bar, isn't it? But they had the discotheque upstairs. And we would go upstairs and they would play all the New Order and Bauhaus and that kind of stuff, which I wasn't interested in yet back then because I was still listening to classic rock. I listened to a lot of Yes and Led Zeppelin back then, you know. But all my friends were listening to New Order and we would go down there and that's where we would see Perfect Jewish Couple. So, you know, remember, even though it was the early 80s, I was still only in high school, and I wasn't old enough to get into some places, too. I didn't have a fake ID yet. That came later. And I got my fake ID just so I could go see bands, because I was never really a big drinker. I really just wanted to go see bands. I got a fake ID so I could go see the Bears, you know, when they played their first gig. But I never got to see the Raisins because I didn't have a fake ID yet. I was still just barely under that age gap back then.
So what year did you go in college?
85. I'm class of 85, and then I spent a good 5.5 years in college to get my 4-year degree, because I told you I spent a lot of time partying. And I don't regret it, I really don't. This part is probably inappropriate for your interview, but I don't mind saying it. If I'd have spent a little more time focusing on some of the stuff that we were doing on campus, I think it would have prepared me now for some of the musical stuff I'm doing now. I didn't listen to that music that they were teaching me until I got out of college. You know, when I was in school, I had a teacher that was teaching serialism, which is the 12-tone technique of Schoenberg, Webern, and Berg. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. It's a style, all right? The guy taught it like math. Dr. Lake. If you're out there, Dr. Lake, right? You taught it like math, dude, and everybody in my class agreed with me that you sucked the soul out of it. It was when I got out of school and started listening to some of this stuff that I realized it was beautiful. And not just beautiful, it's among some of the most beautiful music ever written. And to this day, now, I'll swear by Webern and Berg, even though everything Webern wrote was only 19 seconds long, it's some of the most beautiful stuff you'll ever hear, if you have a short attention span. And there's other 12-tone music that you can find by Boulez and other composers. The Requiem Canticles by Stravinsky, right? Dr. Lake, if you'd have taught me that in college, I would have hated it, because you taught it like algebra. And I was never good at algebra anyway. That's why I went into music, because I wasn't good at the math stuff in high school, right? Well, I get out of college, and I start realizing that there's a lot of stuff that I was told about in college that I blew off. Well, that's a bunch of horseshit. But then I go, no, wait a minute. This is really beautiful music. Mahler, Messiaen, right? You guys, are you familiar with Oliver Messiaen, the composer? I had a teacher, Robert Spano, said to me once, you've never heard Messiaen? Go listen to the Quartet for the End of Time. Well, I didn't listen to it for a long time after that, but when I did, I was blown away. I was like, this is where it's at. Not all that Van Halen crap we were listening to in high school. And if I'd have focused on that a little bit more between 19 and 23, I think it would have benefited me more now that I'm over 30. So if there's any young people watching this, stay in school and don't do drugs. I said that already. Now, like I said, I really don't regret anything because, you know, I made friends I have to this day, and I really do enjoy smoking weed. I truly do. To this day, it's the greatest thing in the world. But sometimes you got to do your homework.
When you got back to Cincinnati, how had the music scene changed? Do you remember who was popular then from the time that you were in high school?
Well, keep in mind with that question that there's a 5.5-year gap, and I was in high school and not old enough to go out beforehand. When I got back to Cincinnati in 91, let's call it 91, and through the first part of the 90s, the Clifton music scene was happening. Now, what is a music scene, right? A music scene can be a lot of different things. It's not just in Clifton, but at that time in Clifton, there were a handful of bands that it seemed like it was a rich period for this people in my age group at that time. I told you I was friends with all the guys in Schwa. Schwa was Troy Raska, Jared Ullman, Tim Davidson, and Bart Foster. So I was friends with those guys because they were from Toledo, and I knew them up in Bowling Green. But when I get back down here, there's a whole bunch of groups that I had never heard of. The Ass Ponies, the Wolverton Brothers. Ricky Nye was just getting ready to start his boogie woogie stuff after the Raisins had broke up. And a lot of other bands that I'm forgetting because it's been so. Jimmy D was around back then, and he owned that music store. And guys used to hang out at the music store. It was next to Wizards over there by where Bogart still is. I think it's a tattoo shop now. And I was working at Wizards at the record store because that's what you do when you get out of college. You still got long hair and you work a job. You don't have to start till 11, which is nice. You don't have to get up too early. And you sell records all day. And then you hang out with all your music buddies at night. So there was some party years there too, right after college. And that was fun, looking back on it. Looking back on it, it was a lot more fun than I remember. How had the music scene changed? I'm not addressing how it's changed because I don't know how it changed. I just know when I got back, it was a rich scene. And everybody was pointing at the Afghan Wigs then because they had just gotten signed. At first to Sub Pop, which was a big deal. They were the only band on Sub Pop that wasn't from Seattle. Ever, I think. Maybe that's changed now. At the time. And also, MTV did a segment on the Cincinnati music scene at the time, and I wasn't in that video, but all my friends were. Like if you ever go back and see that MTV segment, which I'm sure the library has archived somewhere, and that would have been like 92 or 93. Brian, you'd know that better than me.
Yeah, it was 92, 93.
Right around then. Every now and then, the guy on Saturday afternoon on WAIF will replay clips from that. The Trash Flow radio guy. He'll play clips from that every now and then. And the Ass Ponies were on that. Chuck Cleaver was in that segment. And I think some of the Wigs guys or some of the Schwa guys may have been in it. And that documentary will tell you more about the Clifton music scene than I ever will. Because I was, again, any music scene, whether it's Seattle or here or the New Orleans music scene in 1900, right? You still only know the people that are your friends, right? So I knew my group of friends and a few stragglers around that scene, but those are the people I hung out with. And it wasn't everybody. And, you know, there was also the cover band guys, which was a different scene. And there were the older guys. See, by then, the Raisins were considered old guys. And all my friends thought the Raisins were old guys. But I liked them, because I liked that stuff in high school. But all my contemporary friends were like, oh, that's old-fashioned. Well, nowadays, there's younger bands. And I'm kind of over the hill. And I don't know who these younger bands are now that are playing up at Motor and the Comet and Northside Tavern or wherever bands are playing these days. Listing Loon. I don't even know where the bands play anymore because at this point, even though I'm still a scenester, I'm not like I used to be, you know? Because I'm not as in touch as I used to be. So I can't really comment on how the music scene has changed since the 90s, other than we had a lot of fun when I was in it. I'll tell you that. If it wasn't fun, I would have done something else. You know, I've been saying for years, if I do this music stuff because it's fun, I should have done something more lucrative. I should have become a doctor or a lawyer or a journalist or an accountant or something, but I do this because it's fun. And, you know, there's two ways to go through life, fun and not fun. So from that point of view, I guess I'm doing the right thing.
Where were some of your favorite places to play at any time?
Planetariums. If I could only have one more gig in my whole life, it would be planetarium. Because I like the whole light show, I like the psychedelic, I like the synesthesia part of it where you can see the sound and you can hear the visuals and it's literally trippy. If your friends want to do a hit of acid and go to it, it's kind of cool, you know. But I like shows like that are a little multimedia and it's not just a band staring at their shoes while they play. I don't care how good the band is. If they're just staring at their shoes while they play, I'm going to go to the bar and get a drink. I got nothing to look at. So personally, but I also like playing jazz gigs. For about a year, my trio was playing over at Hearth. And those were good gigs. We had good crowds. We were playing a more traditional type of straight-ahead jazz. And it would usually be me and Barton, Mike Ronstadt, on the cello. And the straight-ahead jazz guys didn't understand why I had a cello instead of the big bass guy, but the big bass guys don't always show up. And Mike on cello, he always shows up. He's dependable. And dependability, you know what Woody Allen used to say, 90% of success is showing up. And I need a guy who will show up. The gigs we did at Hearth and a jazz clubs are good gigs. I'd like to find another chill jazz club where we could just set up once every week or two, do a gig, you know, fireplace in the corner, fancy cocktails, beautiful women, you know.
Who are some of your favorite jazz musicians in town?
In town, locally? That's the thing. You talk about me playing jazz with a capital J, and sure, I can talk about it, and I can talk about my band camp, and I can promote my gigs, but at the end of the day, I don't think I'm the best guy in town. In fact, far from it. There's so many people in this town who are so good, and if you want to just talk about my instrument, which is the piano, you can start with Steve Schmidt and Ricky Nye and work your way down from there. There are so many good players. I could start rattling off names. Brian Cashwell, Jim Connerly. There's this guy up at CCM, Sergio Pamies. I'm probably mispronouncing his name. He's from Spain. He's new to town. He kicks everybody's ass. That's why they hired him at CCM, because he's world class. I can't hold a candle to these guys. You know, sometimes I have a hard time booking jazz gigs. And when I do, I don't really resent it from the point of view that these other players are really good. Do I compete with these? Maybe on a good day. I try to do some things differently than other guys do to make me stand out. I try to learn different repertoire. I try to bring my own style into things. I try to stylize things my way and do my own arrangements. But at the end of the day, I'd rather go hear Steve play, Steve Schmidt, or one of these guys. And they're young guys too. There's some young guys coming up right now. There's this kid, Max Krieger, who's going to turn everybody around, I think, in the next dozen years if he doesn't leave town. And there's Ben Levin, which is a different kind of a thing, because he does the more boogie-woogie thing like Ricky does, which puts him in a different category than guys like Steve Schmidt. But Ben Levin is world class. I don't understand why he's not in L.A. Ben, if you're listening to this, move to L.A. Go be famous like Harry Connick. If Harry Connick can do it, you can, Ben. Ben could be a millionaire if he wants to be. He's still young and good looking. If he's going to go to L.A., he better go before he's old like us. While he's still got hair, Ben, while you still got hair? Well, one thing I obviously learned was stay in school and don't do drugs. I'm being funny, but I'm actually serious about this. If I'd have known then what I know now. But that applies in a lot of things, right? There's a lot of things. If I knew then what I knew now, I may be renting instead of owning a house, that kind of stuff. So, that's kind of really all I got to say, is if I knew then what I knew now. In the late 50s, when Duke Ellington had a birthday, all the guys in the band, for his birthday, wanted to make him a manuscript of charts for all the songs he'd written over the past 40 years. And back then, they didn't have fake books. Back then, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have PDFs of these things. It was all done by hand. And the Duke Ellington band never wrote anything down. They were that kind of band. They didn't write things down. They just knew the tunes, right? So they thought for his birthday, they would get Duke Ellington a manuscript. They would have it professionally bound with all the tunes written out on sheet music. So they had a guy start copying all the songs down, and they made this big, thick book. And on his birthday, they gave it to Duke Ellington. I don't remember which birthday it was, but it's in his autobiography. And Duke, being the gracious man that he was, said thank you, and he was gracious about it, and he took that manuscript book home, and he put it on a shelf, and he never looked at it again. And later on, they asked him about it, and he said, well, when they give you something like that on your birthday, they're kind of insinuating that your best work is behind you, and that it's all over. And I feel like I still have 20 more years left of hopefully some of the best work I'm yet to do. So I'm not interested in that book. So I don't know if I'm really interested in talking to you guys. I still feel like maybe the best is yet to come. I'm probably wrong, but I'm hoping that we do this gig in February at the Memorial Hall and that you guys all show up and we have a party afterwards. And maybe after that, I get involved in another project or somebody asks me to join their band or maybe something else comes up. So maybe we'll do another one of these in another 15 years. And I'm not Duke Ellington.